Chapter 17, Typhoon. All day under a gyrating sky, Louis and Phil rode the swells, feeling a weary thrill as the island peeked into view. Remember, they've just seen an island like it's been 47 days they've seen an island. Slowly it became distinct. They saw a bright white line where the waves dashed against a beach or reef. That afternoon, one island became two, and then many. Overhead, a colossal storm was gathering. The men rowed landward. The sky broke. A slashing rain came down and the winds vanished. The ocean began heaving and thrashing. The wind sent the raft spinning up swells perhaps 40 feet, then careening down into troughs as big as canyons. Louis and Phil were in a typhoon. Wave after wave slammed into the raft, tipping it sideways and pulling it upward. To stop it from flipping, Louis and Phil bailed water in to keep it down, sat on opposite sides to balance their weight, and lay down to keep the center of gravity low. They held on. Night fell and the storm pounded. The raft raced over hundreds of mountains of water. At times, the men felt themselves flying in the darkness as the raft was swept into the air. Louis felt even more intensely afraid than he had felt as the Green Hornet was falling. The thought of the land that they could no longer see, fearing at any second they could be flung into the reef. Sometime in the night, the storm died away. In its wake came the sweetest scent, soil, greenness, rain washing over living things, the scent of land. As dawn neared, the men heard the hiss of the water scouring a reef. Exhausted, they took turns napping, with one man on the lookout for land. Somewhere along the way, they both fell asleep. They woke in a new universe. After weeks in the open ocean, they were surrounded by islands. One by one, they saw a deserted native village. They had heard of the Japanese capturing and shipping out natives as slaves and wondered if this had happened here. They began racing for shore. Louis had predicted that they would find land on the 47th day. Phil had chosen the 46th. Because they'd spotted land on the 46th and reached the 47th, they decided that they had both been right. Louis gazed at a tiny island with one tree on it. A strange thing happened. The tree became two trees. After a moment's confusion, he suddenly understood. This wasn't an island, and those weren't trees. It was a boat. It had been perpendicular to them, leaving only one mast visible, and then it turned, bringing the rearward mast into view. Louis and Phil ducked and rowed as fast as they could to get ashore before they were spotted, but they were too late. A boat sped towards them. Louis and Phil rowed hard, but the boat caught them and drew alongside the raft. Along the deck stood a line of Japanese men aiming guns at Louis and Phil. A sailor threw a rope and Louis caught it. He and Phil tried to climb up under the boat, but their legs were too weak. The sailors tied them to a rope ladder and dragged them up. On the deck, Louis and Phil tried to rise, but their legs buckled. With the sailors hurting them, they crawled to the mast. The sailors lashed them to it and bound their hands behind them. A sailor spoke to them in Japanese, apparently asking questions. Another waved a bayonet past Louis's face, trying to hack off his beard. One cracked a pistol into Phil's jaw and then moved to do the same thing to Louis. Louis tipped his head forward and then, when the sailor swung, jerked his head back. He made the man miss but smacked his head against the mast. The captain approached and chastised the crewmen, and the mood changed. Louis and Phil's hands were untied and they were given water and 2 biscuits. Louis ate slowly, savoring each crumb. It was the first food that he had had in 8 days. Louis and Phil were transferred to a second boat, where a crewman fed them more biscuits and some coconut. A man approached, Japanese-English dictionary in hand, and asked questions. Phil and Louis told of their journey. A boat blew up to an island. Louis and Phil were blindfolded, drew up to an island, and Louis and Phil were blindfolded, and men half carried them off the boat. After a few minutes, Louis felt himself being laid down on something soft. His blindfold was removed. He and Phil were in an infirmary lying on beds. An infirmary is kind of like a hospital for army men. Through a window, he saw Japanese soldiers thrusting bayonets into dummies. An officer spoke to the Japanese surrounding the castaways and then spoke in English, apparently repeating himself so Louis and Phil could understand. "These are American flyers," he said. "Treat them gently." A doctor came in, smiled, examined Louis and Phil, and smoothed ointment on their salt sores. Louis and Phil took turns standing on a scale, each with a man ready to catch him if his legs failed. Phil, who had weighed about 150 pounds when he'd stepped aboard the Green Hornet, now weighed about 80 pounds. By different accounts, 5-foot, 10-inch Louis, who weighed 160 pounds before the crash, weighed just 67 pounds, 79.5 pounds, or 87 pounds. The doctors had cognac, eggs, milk, ham, fresh bread, and fruit salad brought in, and Louis and Phil feasted. When they were done, they were seated before Japanese officers who gaped at the shrunken yellow men. An officer asked how they'd ended up here, and Louis told the story as the officers listened, fascinated. Louis and Phil knew that where their journey had begun, but he didn't know where they had ended. The officer told them. They were in the Marshall Islands. They had drifted 2,000 miles. 2 beds were made up, and the castaways were invited to rest. Slipping between the cool, clean sheets, their stomachs full, their sores soothed, they were deeply grateful. Phil had a relieved thought. They are our friends, so they're finally relieved to be on land. They think that they've got it made. They're in a hospital. They're taking care of them. They have food. They're nice to them. And Phil's thinking they are our friends. Louis and Phil stayed in the infirmary for 2 days, attended by kind Japanese. On the 3rd day, an officer came bearing beef, chocolate, coconuts, and news. They were being taken to another atoll. An atoll is an island. The name he gave sent a tremor through Louis. Kwajalein. It was the place known as Execution Island. "After you leave here," the officer said, "we cannot guarantee your life." Aboard the freighter, Louis and Phil were treated well, but as they drew up to Kwajalein, the Japanese suddenly became harsh. On came the blindfolds, and Louis and Phil were carried ashore and dumped on a hard surface. When Louis said something to Phil, a boot kicked him as a voice shouted, "No!" An engine started and they were moving. They were on a truck. In a few minutes, the truck stopped, and Louis was tugged out and carried again. There was walking, a darkening, and a feeling of being thrown backwards. Louis's back struck a wall, and he fell to the floor. Someone yanked off his blindfold. A door slammed. A lock turned. At first, Louis could barely see. His eyes darted around uncontrollably. His mind raced, flitting wildly from one thought to another. After weeks of endless openness, he was disoriented by the compression of space around him. Slowly, his thoughts quieted and his eyes settled. He was in a cell, about the length of his body and a little wider than his shoulders. There was a small window in the door. The door was strewn with gravel, dirt, and maggots. The floor was strewn. And the room hummed with flies and mosquitoes, already swarming on him. There was a hole in the floor with a latrine bucket below it. The air hung scorching hot and heavy, still with the stench of human waste. Louis looked up. In the dimness, he saw the words carved onto the wall. 9 Marines marooned on Macon Island, August 12, 1942. Below were the Marines' 9 names. In August 1942, after an American raid on a Japanese base at Macon in the Marshall Islands, 9 Marines had mistakenly been left behind. Captured by the Japanese, they had disappeared. Louis almost certainly was the first American to learn that they had been taken to Kwajalein, but they weren't here now. Louis felt a wave of foreboding. He called out to Phil. Phil's voice answered, distant and small. He was down the hall in a squalid hole just like Louis's. They asked each other if he was okay. They knew that it was likely this would be the last time they'd talk, but if they wished to say goodbye, neither had the chance. There was a shuffling in the corridor as a guard took up his station. Then Louis and Phil went quiet. Louis looked down at his body. Legs that had sprung through a 4-minute, 12-second mile on the last Hawaiian morning were now useless. His vibrant body had shrunken until only the bones remained, draped in yellow skin, crawling with parasites. "All I see," he thought, is a dead body breathing. He dissolved into hard, racking weeping. He muffled his sobs so the guards wouldn't hear him.